Almost a year ago, I did a video talking about all the factions coming to Thrawn's Revenge. Today, we wanted to go over the state of those future factions and cover some extra information that's come up since the video was made. At the start of that video, I explained some limitations on faction slots in Empire at War, which were resulting in previously our having to make the Yuuzhans unplayable, and which would later be forcing us to remove the Ariado authority in a future release. Luckily, the Steam patch in January included a fix for the faction slot bugs, which means we now have up to 100 potential faction slots to work with. As a result, we no longer have to remove the Ariado authority, and we can also announce the return of the Duskin League, which is the Yuuzhan faction we had to cut a few versions ago. Primarily though, today we're going to be talking about what the state of the other future factions are, and address one of the most common questions we get, namely, when will each of them become playable? To refresh everyone, these upcoming factions are the Hapes, the Hutts, Corellians, Siruvi, Yuuzhan Vong, Chiss, Killik, and now the Yuuzhan. Basically, it's impossible for us to give a specific time frame for any specific piece of content, but each faction is expected to follow a relatively similar trajectory. First, factions will be added with core parts of their rosters in a non-playable form. This may be part of a story event, or like the Hapes have been, as a non-playable minor faction on the map. From there, we'll continue to flesh them out and expand their presence until they hit a breakpoint, but we decide they're worth playing, at which point we'll make them playable. Usually this will require at least 6 space units, not including a couple fighter types, and at least 3 distinct ground units. Ideally, also some basic form of government mechanics like the New Republic's elections and command staff. This obviously isn't an upper limit for content, it's just kind of the baseline requirement to be playable at all. Each would naturally become more fleshed out as they went after that. The upcoming Point 2 release should see at the very least the return of the playable Yuuzhan, who we won't talk about directly in this video since they were touched on a bit in the Imperial roster breakdowns, and will probably get their own coverage in the future. It's not impossible another faction will become playable in this period as well. Almost every faction has had some level of work done on them, and we'll be running down the general progress of each one of them, with some quick looks at some of their in-progress content. First, we'll talk about the faction with the highest chance of becoming playable in 3.2, the Hapes consortium. We've been on the verge of Hapen playability for some time now, thanks to all of Valerie's fantastic designs, and Aceritzel's ridiculously fast output of models. We have about 20 space models ready to texture, including unique star bases, and even 2 ground units that Aceritzel's modeled, which were designed by Valerie as well. Inertial worked off some of Valerie's initial infantry concepts to create the core Hapen infantry model, which has been in the mod for a couple versions now, with a few variants we plan to make for different houses. Sleverd is currently in the process of working up a style guide and material set for their textures, which should be relatively simple to do once we have that style guide and those materials. Once that's done, we'll be ready to code them in and get started on some of their government mechanics, which puts them pretty much at the stated criteria for a faction to become playable, especially in space where they'd be far above that. This isn't a guarantee that they'd become playable in 3.2, but they have a really good shot. Here you can see one of Aceritzel's Hapen models, an updated Nova Cruiser with the texture recently done by Evil Bob the Bob. Next up we have the Siruvi Imperium. Over the Point 1 development cycle, Inertial created our new Siruvi infantry model, which was the main thing we were waiting on to add the spacefaring dinosaurs as a non-playable faction. We have a set of at least 4 ships, including their swarm droid fighters from our Sins mod, Ascendancy, which we've been able to move over to Empire at War, so they're functional on ground and in space at a similar level as the Hapens have been in prior releases. These space models are quite old and definitely need redoing, but they work for setting up the functionality of the basic faction, which means we can start plugging in the Siruvi worlds to Galactic Conquest maps, and that should make the Galactic South a bit more interesting, as well as give us something to work off of more for Unknown Regions maps. Staying in the Unknown Regions, we have the Chiss Ascendancy. The big question with the Chiss is going to be their government mechanics related to the Empire of the Hand, and making sure that each faction stays true and unique to their core despite sharing a good part of their rosters. Units like the Syndic and Fruro are intended as Chiss designs, so they'll be part of both factions. A couple units that are part of the Empire of the Hand that don't fit that design family, like the Ascendancy Star Destroyer and the kind of imperialized versions of ships, those remain solely as Empire of the Hand content. On top of that, Aceritzel has completed 3 further designs in the same family, intended exclusively for Chiss use. On ground, we'll initially be sharing their roster with the Empire of the Hand, but when the Empire of the Hand's ground reworks happen, which will hopefully start at some point in 3.2, that'll include determining a whole new unique roster for the Chiss Ascendancy on ground as well. They were initially intended to show up as non-playable in the Point 1 release, but were postponed to make sure we had some extra time to flesh them out a bit more. So they should hopefully at least show up as non-playable in 3.2, similar to the Siruvi. Moving back to the known galaxy, we're going to talk about the faction where the least has been done so far, Corellia. Corellia is going to be somewhat unique as a faction that can emerge in its Rebellious Confederation version as the game progresses, so this is where the primary push for Legacy of the Force content will happen. It's going to essentially flip between two versions. There's the starter Imperialized Corellia, which is governed by the Diktat, and the Confederation Corellia, each with its own unique aspects. There will be some presence of Imperial hardware with the Imperial version of Corellia, and that's probably what you can expect at first, but there are a lot of Corellian-specific assets which will be coming for both versions of the faction, including ships like the HLAF fighter, which is already in prior releases, and the Strident, which will be in upcoming releases, Valerie's design for which can be seen right now. You can probably expect a Corellian faction to show up on the map in 3.2, but it'll likely receive the least movement in this version as far as new content goes or current plans for new content. Next up, we're continuing east to talk about some slugs. The Hutts have had their territory marked on the map for quite some time, and they've been just a sad collection of unrelated independent forces for years. That should change with some dedicated Hutt assets coming in 3.2. We have a couple models done for them and pretty solid plans for a fairly complete roster and government mechanics across several of our mods. The Hutts are probably the most likely faction to show up in like every project we do. Most people do seem to expect the Hutts to be some sort of mishmash of old Clone Wars ships or something, but there's a plethora of dedicated Hutt craft which will be forming the core of their roster, including a few name designs which were never pictured before, like the Cossack, which Valerie did a design for and Inertial did a model for, and which is one of the first units we'll be releasing for them. The model for that was actually in the files of prior releases, but we're going to be giving it some updates and then putting it in the actual game. We will of course also be representing their criminal underworld elements as part of the faction. Now, before we get to the Vong, which I assume is what everyone's waiting for, we've got to talk about something that's been bugging me, Killiks. The Killiks are still somewhere in their infancy as a faction where we, mainly Inertial, are primarily doing some art style exploration and beginning work on some of the government mechanics and roster concepting. We have a few really cool ideas with them involving some of the other hive species across the galaxy, as well as a couple concepts or test versions for certain ships, so I think that while they're probably not one of the more popular factions, they have some really unique opportunities to offer, and people will hopefully come around on them. While Corellia may be receiving the least work right now, it's probably the Killiks who are least likely to show up in 3.2 directly, even though we'll hopefully have some assets ready. Finally, that brings us to the Yuuzhan Vong. These extragalactic invaders are going to be difficult to get right, but like with the Killiks, they can provide a lot of unique opportunities for game mechanics and story events. While you're almost certainly not going to see a full GC or Galactic Conquest built around them just yet, we do have several ship models made and some even textured for them as well as a basic infantry model. Their organic style makes them really hard to execute visually, especially on ground, but Slevert has already worked up a style guide for doing their ships and their textures, based on some official images which we hope will help give them a consistent, creepy look while toning down some of the outright ugly elements of their visual appearance in some official depictions. We want to emphasize the coral and alien appearance of their living ships without going too far into the ugly brown rock direction. That's going to be more the Killiks direction. Hopefully helping to keep them all visually distinct and visually interesting. There's no guarantees, but hopefully you'll have a chance to interact with some of them as early as the 3.2 release.